Hi and welcome to the Dutch PHP Conference 2020 edition. We're so glad that you've chosen to be here with us today. We hope you find it a valuable investment of your time. We've got a great speaker coming up for you, but real quick, I want to give a huge shout out to my buddies at iBuildings for putting on this conference all these many years. I've been involved in this conference since about 2007 when I spoke at one of the first ones and just absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite PHP conferences ever, and one of the main reasons that it's my favorite is that iBuildings puts on a great conference. So Tom, Yoni, and Angela, and all the iBuildings staff, thank you all for all the hard work that you've put into this. Now, let's get on with the show. It is now my great privilege to introduce to you a man who needs no introduction. He's been around the PHP community a lot longer than I have, and he is responsible for one of the three tools that every PHP developer should be using on a regular basis. That's Xdebug. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over. Angela, you want to swap us over to Derick? I'm going to turn it over to my good friend, Mr. Derick Rethans.
Good morning, everybody. I would have wished to be in Amsterdam with you all today to have another fabulous DPC, but as things go, it seems we have to do this online. But of course, it does mean that there's a lot more people attending from all over the world, which is always good to see. And sorry for the people like Cal that have to get up in the middle of the night for this. But yeah, we can't change that yet. So the next about 40 minutes, I'll be talking about what's new in PHP 7.4. and what's coming up in PHP 8, with one caveat, of course, is that PHP 8 isn't out yet. So the things that I'll be talking about there, they might change in the future. But without further ado, let's get going. So hi, I'm Derick. I'm European living in London. As Carl already mentioned, I do Xdebug. I also host a podcast called PHP Internals News, where I will actually talk with all the different people that contribute to the PHP project to see what they're up to. And this is also where you'd be able to listen about all the new features in much more detail that I'll be able to do here in this next 45 minutes or something like that. All right, now let's continue with the real content here. Okay, as you saw in my previous slide, I quite like whiskey. It's a bit too early, to be honest, for that right now. But I tend to use the things I like in my example. So let's get going with this one here. I also am really evil and like using emojis in my class names, because that makes it a lot harder for other people to use, which is of course great. Now, probably continuing with what PHP has been doing over the last many releases is it's been strengthening its typing system. In PHP 7.4, we added typed properties, and they look something like this. So just beyond the public, protected, and private, and the variable name, you can now insert your type. And the values of these properties are always going to have to conform to this type. Now, that's great. So you can do that for both public, protected, and private. And as you can see here, we use it for both integers, just scalar values, classes, or even nullable classes like this here. You can also make them static if you want to do them. In this case, we use an iterable, which is a PHP built-in theme. You can give them default values and so on and so on. And if you really want it, you can actually define multiple variable names on the same line, and all the keywords, both public and bool, will apply to all of them, which is quite good, but I think no coding standard actually allows you to do that. So perhaps don't use that then. All right, now I'm going to ask a few questions here, and I am, sorry, this is the first time I do this online with so many people. So let me go find the chat window here. Where did Zoom go? So in the chat, oh, I shouldn't share the chat with you all. I'll ask a question and let me know what you think the output of this script is. So we instantiate a new whiskey class and we're echoing the value of age. You can see zeros, lots of zeros. An error, oh, okay. I've done this previously with about 20 people, and then I could see all the answers. Now I have no chance with 1,000 of you here. But the answer is actually, it isn't 0. You get actually an error message. You get the error message saying that the type property whiskey H must not be accessed before initialization. So it's important to realize that the uninitialized state is checked when you're reading from a property for the first time. All right, so let's continue. So now we have a class whiskey. We attach the string distillery to the property distillery. What will we get out of this? Keeping an eye on the Slack again. An error, invalid type, yeah. You all have seen this before because, of course, PHP 7.4 has been out for more than a year now. You get indeed an error. It tells you need to have an instance of distillery, but we use a string. That makes perfect sense. So type validation is checked when you're writing through a property, is what I'm trying to get you away from here. Now, there's a few gotchas in here as well. Like if you assign the string 29 to H, just like in a previous example, H is defined as an integer, not as a string. So you would usually expect that to throw a type error, but you won't get a type error because we haven't defined strict types, and PHP's type coercion rules still apply here. So this will output, just as you would expect, the H29. If you do not want that to happen, which is likely what you don't want to happen if you use type properties, because you're sort of opted into the more strictness already anyway, is by setting strict types, of course. And by setting strict types, then you'll get the error again that the whiskey H must be an int and we use a string, which is what we're expecting here. All right. In addition to the type properties that came into PHP 7.4, PHP 7.4 also adds things that weren't allowed earlier. Like in PHP 7.3, if you had defined a function, then a return type of the inherited function should also be the same. Now, the functionality in 7.4 extends this so that both return types as well as argument types and the new property types now follow more this principle called the Barbara-Liskov substitution principle, which basically the concept is that if you have code using a class, then the code using that class should also be able to use an inherited class in exactly the same places without anything being able to break. And that's what we're having here. So we have a bakery that makes bread. So the method gimme returns bread. And a baguette is a subtype of bread, which is a narrower type. In something that extends the bakery here, in this case a patisserie, they only make more specific kind of bread, the subtype of bread called baguette, which means that inherited method gimme here can return this smaller type called baguette. If you look at this, if you originally had code that made use of the bakery class and we'd call the gimme method on it, that code would always expect there to be a bread coming back. But it's perfectly okay if a subtype of bread comes back, because baguette in this case, because we'd still be able to deal with this because baguette extends bread. So that is sort of what LSP is about. Being able to use an inheritance class in all the places where you originally could use the class. And for a return type, that means that you can return a more specific type, and that is called covariance. If you do this the other way around, in this case, returning a wider type, you can't do that, and you get an error message saying you had a fatal error, the declaration of patisserie gimme must be compatible with bakery baguette. I see a question in the Q&A here saying that if you have an initialized property that is nullable and you try to read from it, will that throw an error? Yes, unless you have defined this with the default value as null. Click those away. All right, let's continue with the next thing to look at, which is the argument types. So the argument types work exactly the other way around. In an inherited class, a method can choose to accept a broader type. This is fine for the original calling code, because if they would only instantiate these classes with a more specific type, that's still fine. That is not going to break. So in this example, we have a pig which is quite a wide range of animals. And we have the class boar that extends the pig, a boar being a more specific kind of animal. So for example, if asterisks can hunt for boars only, it is fine to have an extended class called goals that can hunt more than one animal, in this case, all the pigs. So it is fine for argument types to be contra-variant. Sorry, I'm just going through all the questions here. Please don't say thank you, because it just things I need to click away. All right, so those are covariant and contra-variant. Of course, if you then do this the other way around, you get an error, as you'd expect. Now, the third thing here is that the newly introduced type properties are invariant, meaning that you cannot return a broader type or a more specific type. Because if an original calling class would write to the property and then read from it, in either cases, it is either it has to be the same type, otherwise it can't be sure that the data in it is correct. So in property types, you can't change. And you get an error in this case if you try to do that, as you would expect. Now, PHP 8 is going to continue to build on this concept by adding more types to it again. In this case, these are called union types. Now, union types will also interact correctly with the Barbara-Listoff substitution principle, but I'm not going to have the time to go through all the examples here. So I'll just focus on what this is. But let's take this class. It's called a number. I know it's not very imaginative, and we have defined this as a private method, and we have getNumber and setNumber on it. But in this case, we are perfectly okay with numbers to be both an integer and a floating point type. But PHP cannot, up to PHP 8, deal with that, because you can only give properties and return types and arguments a single type only. In PHP 8, that is going to extend it with union types. So you will be able to define this, which you always had to do with PHP doc comments, like these are here. But in PHP 8, you will be able to do these things by using union types, which is awesome, because that means you now don't have to rely on external tooling like PHP Stan or Psalm or any of the other static analysis tools to be able to enforce your types and to make sure that this is all checked. And that means that this is all embedded, and you can also get to that information with reflection. Now, with regards to these property types and argument types and return types here, the LSP principle will still apply. So what you could do in a inheriting class, you could change the setNumber class to accept a wider type. So you could, for example, do int, float, or string if you want to do that, and things like that. Question being asked, is this a good practice to allow union types? In this case, with int and float, it's probably a bad idea. However, in order to make a more broader example, it's also not going to fit on my slide. Another question asking, what about collection types, like an array of int? Is there any progress on that? These things are often also called generics. And although generic is something that we, or rather Nikita has been looking into, it isn't nowhere ready to do, because it isn't very simple in PHP, especially because there's so many possibilities of having different semantics. So this isn't something we're going to see for PHP 8, but it might show up later. Another question, is it possible to make the union of int, float, and void? It is not, because you can't put void in a union, but I think I have that on my next slide, or one of the. All right, so as an example here, it is actually already quite a common pattern to have this in the PHP runtime itself. So for example, microtime normally returns a string. It returns a string unless you pass an argument, get as float, and then it returns a float. And this isn't something that is possible to represent in PHP before PHP 8. And in this case, that means that, yeah, you can now correctly do this. And that also means that PHP 8 has been working on getting all this information inside the engine so that for all the internal functions, you can also get this information through reflection. And by having this information available there also means that the PHP engine can do more type enforcement, although that hasn't always and everywhere been implemented yet. It is something that will be able to happen in the future. All right. In case you didn't notice that here, if you get like these longer function and argument definitions, you could not do a comma at the end, but in PHP 8, you'll be able to use a comma at the end of arguments. In functioning declaration, which is kind of nice, but a minor feature. So there's a few rules around union types. You can't avoid as part of a union type. The nullable class is equivalent to class null. False is a specific addition to the type system, but only as a type hint. And that is because traditionally in PHP, there's many internal functions that would reuse int or false, like strpos. And because this is such a common occurring pattern, you can use false as part of your union, but you can't use true. It's also not possible to use a redundant type, such as a union of bool or false, or object or whiskey, because whiskey is already an object. As I mentioned, the variants also gets adhered to here. They follow the standard variant rules. The order of the union type is irrelevant, so int string is the same as string int. And the other shortcut that's made is that array reversible is the same as iterable. All right. Now, sometimes if you don't use strict mode, then there is some logic implemented to make sure that the type coercion still works, and in the order of preference of types done in the union type is we first try to convert it to an integer. If that doesn't work, we try to convert it to a float, if these are part of the union type, that is, to a string, and then to a bool. And this is pretty much what you would expect it to do. Okay, there's another question I see about, are there any plans to replace type or false within PHP core functions with an exceptional error? Yes, some work of that is being done, but we're making sure that this is not something that is going to break backwards compatibility, because if a function would instead return false, now suddenly starts throwing an exception, that's a BC break. So we can't do that. If false would have been returned because there was a programmatic error, then you would not get an exception, but instead you would be able, you would get false back again. And said that, do union types allow more than 2 types? All your example used to, yes, this is definitely possible, and I'll have an example in a future slide. All right, so in this case, the examples, if we have the union type int or string, then 42.2 will be 42 because it conforms to an int. 42.1 will also be an integer, so it gets truncated to 42, which is exactly what happens if you normally typecast an integer. If the float is too large, it will return into a string. Infinity is also a really large number, like it's infinity, will also be a string. True would be 1, and so on and so on. If the types can't be coerced, then you'd get exactly the same things as you would get by normal type conversion of a new object with a new array, for example, or sorry, an array can be converted to either an integer or a string. So you get a type error instead. All right, so to get back to the question is it possible to have a union type with more than 2 types? The answer is yes. And PHP actually introduces a new built-in type that's called mixed, which is basically a union of array or bool or callable or int or float or null or object or resource or string. Now, why would you want to have something like mixed? Well, it's sort of useful in a few cases. And you can use it if you're converting codes to code that is typed, to denote saying, well, this function really can return pretty much everything. And by using mixed in your code, although it necessarily doesn't enforce a lot, it will then tell you as a person upgrading the code that you have looked at this code and you don't have to do this before. So using mix versus not using mix, functionality-wise, there isn't a lot of things happening there, but it distinguishes basically in your code, I didn't alter type yet, or it really accepts any value. So it is kind of useful to have it in there. And that is similar to what somebody was asking on QA a bit, TypeScript any or Flutter's dynamic. Okay, let me continue with some other features. So let's get back to my Whiskey class. See, I have 4 properties here, and in my constructor, I need to assign all of them. And you can see that gets really annoying, right? Because it gets too big, the line is too long. And there's a lot of boilerplate. How often do you use the same type name here? Or the same argument name? Like name is done 3 times. The types are done twice. You have to type this all the time. This is kind of annoying. And it makes constructing constructors also kind of tricky and annoying in implementation. Whereas PHP 8 will now have something called constructor property promotion, where you can distill this down to just this. So in this case, we have a constructor defined, and inside the argument list to the constructor, we also specify the visibility of it. So we have public string name, and that basically means exactly the same thing as I've here on this slide. So it does the definition of the property, it does the argument here, and it does the assignment. So it does all of these things at the same time for you. I see there's a few more questions about mixed types. I'm going to move on, but I will answer those afterwards. I think property construction is pretty nice, and there are also some plans that go further than that. So this, what I'm showing you now in the next few slides, isn't in PHP 8 yet. It isn't proposed yet, but I think there's a pretty big chance that this will be done. But I can't guarantee it will make it into PHP 8, but it would be lovely to have, in my opinion. So we now have this lovely way of doing this constructor argument promotion, so we don't have to do all the different variable assignments. Kuhn is asking about, is it possible to have pretty much both using the arguments that are coming in as well as doing logic in here? Yes, you can do that. You can do partial constructor promotion if you want to do that. That is absolutely possible. There is a question about, does this work for inherited properties? I can't see why not, but there's no reason why this can't work for inherited properties. It basically is just syntactic sugar for doing all the boilerplate code. It is pretty much the PHP logic in the engine would not see a difference, yeah. All right, now, this is kind of annoying because what if I want to construct a whiskey objects where I would only set whiskey to sort by field to something else, right? So if we want to do an instant change with different includes and we only want to change one, what does false, true, and false mean? Can you say what it is? I don't know. You have to go read the code with all the arguments, all right? And of course, I know IDE helps with that, but there you go. Or what if you don't want to change a different sort order? Like instead of sorting by whiskey name, you want to sort by rating. You can't really do that either because you need to remember all the default values of all the previous arguments. So there is a proposal that is being written, but it hasn't been proposed yet for inclusion, that is pretty much named arguments. So instead of having to do all the different includes, you can instantly see which arguments you're actually setting. So in this case, we're setting include distillery to false. And we don't have to remember which of my arguments include distillery or description or tasting notes is, and so on. And you can just do the sort by field. So not only for constructors, this is a much easier way of doing this because you instantly know what all your variables are. And of course, you can still use them as positional arguments if you want to do that. It makes it a lot easier for creating constructors. Sorry, just reading questions here. So there's a question about constructor argument promotion. What happens if we define the appropriate property in both properties and in a constructor signature? What takes precedence? I don't know the answer for sure, but I believe you actually get an error because you shouldn't be able to do this. Moving on. A question about the named arguments. Is this only going to be restricted to the constructor or also for any method? This is something that isn't done for only the constructor. It's going to be for any method. I'm just illustrating it with a constructor because that is, in my opinion, the most useful place for doing it. Because there are some issues by the inclusion of named arguments, because it means that suddenly everybody has written any library code, the variable names or the argument names are now suddenly part of your API. And that is quite a bit of a BC break, because you now suddenly start requiring that library authors not only take care of the function signature with the type, but also that the names they use are going to be consistent. And there's a whole bunch of other issues related to this. If you want to listen what it all means, there's an episode of PHP Internal News, link in the bottom, that you then can use to listen to that whole conversation, because that takes about 20 minutes to explain. Right. So this is not approved yet, so big warning. Something that is approved, however, and is part of the current PHP 8.0 Alpha 1, that was supposed to come out next Thursday, but it came out yesterday, a week early, yay, is something like attributes. I think most of you have seen a pattern like this, especially if you deal with ORMs, where you define that my private type name, of course, in PHP 7.4, you can now just add the string type as well to your property definition. But in case you need to define a database related type, you can do that by things like this, right? So in this case, we say that the private name is my ID, my identifier, my primary key of my record. And this, in this case, is a database type called string. This works all fine, but it isn't part of the PHP language. The only thing that the language guarantees you is that the doc comment, the thing that starts with 2 stars, is part of reflection. And then through reflection, you can then get through the whole block and do your own matching on it. Now, in PHP 8, we're finally getting something called attributes, which allow you to use a language-specific feature to mark specific things. Now, before you all start yelling about the syntax of this with the, how do you call this, the pointy brackets on both sides, this is something that is very likely going to change. From what I remember, the front runner at the moment is currently the @@. As I said, PHP 8 is in pre-release, so things might still change until we have feature freeze. But it doesn't matter for the discussion. I'll just illustrate what these things actually do here for you. So instead of using doc blocks to mark distillery as an entity and the private name as an ID of type string, we're using new syntax that the PHP engine understands, and hence will also make sure that if you make typos in it, you'll get your parse errors out of it. So in this case, the way how you tag attributes is pretty much by remembering that these things are all classes. So which means that you can actually define shortcuts through namespaces so that you don't have to type instead of ORM here, doctrine, ORM, attribute, entity, because that is really annoying to have to type all the time. All the arguments here that you see, that's pretty much what they're going to be. They're going to be arguments to the constructor that gets called when we use reflection later to instantiate the attribute ORM column. I have an example of that, so don't worry if that went too quick for you. So the ORM column is a class name here, and the string argument is your constructor argument. All right, so let's have a look at how we actually would use this. So here what we have is in the top, we have an even smaller example about a distillery, and we say that private name is a column. It's my ORM attributes column, and we have string. Now, in order to actually make use of the attributes and to make sure that the PHP engine enforces validation, when you call new instance, and I'll go back to how you would deal that later, this class will get constructed for you, the column here, because this my ORM attributes column is the same as my ORM attributes column, because this is the class that we define here. As long as you tag these things with PHP attribute, very likely going to change to just attribute, Reflection now knows what to do with this. Now, if we loop over the attributes of the property name, that's the third example here. So we create a reflection class for the distillery. We get the property name. Now RP defines to the reflection, reflection object for the name properties. By calling get attributes, you get a whole list of all the attributes that are defined on this type. In this case, we only have column, but there could be more than one, which we can then echo. If we call get attribute arguments, you will get all the arguments to the attribute. So in this case, you'll get an array with one element saying string. But up to this point, no checking has been done whether the arguments that you have been passing in is actually correct. No enforcement is done on anything. That only happens if you call new instance on the attribute. So what new instance on an attribute reflection element does, it will create now this object column, and it passes the string here as argument to the constructor. And then of course it's up to you. I left it empty here, but it's up to you to then make sure that string is actually a valid column type. If it isn't, you can then throw an exception. So the new attribute is more of a engine-based way of doing the attributes that ORMs already have. And as extra benefits, of course, you get PHP's type checking in there. And it also means that all of these things, all of these types are more standardized among all the different possibilities. I quite like attributes. It took me about 10 years to get me interested enough to want to do this. And I think the current implementation that's making it to PHP 8 is probably the best way that we could do here. Yes, just to show the output of the script that I have here on the bottom left. So you get the type of the attribute, the array with all the arguments, and then in the end, you get attribute column with type string without me having done any validation here. And of course, you can also use constructor property promotion here as well if you want to do it. Right. Are there any questions about this? So there's one question that says, why do attributes need to be annotated before they can be used? If you don't define the attributes here, then reflection doesn't know what to do with it. If the question instead was, if that was not the question, Alex, then you have to ask it again. All right, moving on. As I said, yeah, PHP attribute is going to change the attribute. There's currently a vote going on, which I think runs out today or either tomorrow or something like that, to change a few of the things in attributes so that PHP attribute becomes attribute and the pointy syntax on both sides will turn into an at in front of it. But I don't know that for sure. If you use PHP Alpha 1, PHP 8 Alpha 1, and my slides, the examples on my slides will work. Okay, I see there's a few more questions here. How does the PHP attribute annotation work internally? When is it read? This is read the moment the new instance auto loads your class. So new instance, that is of course if you haven't included this file yet here, if new instance will include this class, it sees column, and if it does not have the attribute type, then it will refuse to do it. The new instance will not work unless you attribute it with the PHP or soon to be attribute tag. This is just an extra way of making sure that you're not making any typos in here. Because if, for example, you had a column and a col class, I know, contrived example, and you had misspelled column by col because you, for example, auto-completed it, then the col class would not be able to know what to do with it. So it's basically an extra way to making sure that you're not making typos. So hopefully that answers your question, Marijn. There's another question by Dave saying, with attributes, can you find all the classes that have an attribute, e.g. entity, without having to iterate through every class? No, you cannot do that, because as far as I know, there's no way of listing all the classes that the PHP engine has seen through reflection, and you can only do it class by class. So there's no iterative way of finding all the entities. This isn't a database. All right, so attributes, use cases, replace it in PHP doc annotation and doctrine and symphony, etc. It's possible that we might actually introduce specific attributes type. For example, deprecated, that will then throw a deprecation warning. Or there's already an annotation in PHP 8 JIT, I might get back to that in a moment, where you can, with a doc comment saying, I don't want to JIT this function, for example. So these can also be converted to attributes. Somebody's asking, is this an enable to use feature? Nope, you don't need to enable anything. This will be part of PHP 8. Moving on. There's going to be the most of the next few features are all going to be simple features, but I guess that's fine. There's a few new string functions. They were originally suggested to be included for PHP 7.4, but they were too complicated. So PHP 8 will have easier ways of, well, simpler versions of these new functions. There's str contains. Does a string contain another string? We get string starts with and string ends with. And I think they're just nice little functions so that you don't have to substring or strpros with complicated, sometimes logic to make sure that strings start or end with specific things. There are no multi-byte variants of these or case insensitive versions of these. So if you want to use them, you have to use UTF-8. It doesn't do multi-bytes. And if you want to do this with lowercase, then you still will have to do this by hand. Another new thing in PHP 8 is the weak map. The weak map functionality extends the weak reference class that came into PHP 7.4. It is basically a way of making sure that you can cache information, but it wouldn't prevent internal memory manager from cleaning things up. So a typical thing here where this is often used is to go back to my ORM example. An ORM needs to keep track of metadata for each object that is being loaded. And how most ORMs do that, they do that with a map to mapping the object with its metadata. The thing though, if you do that, then PHP's memory manager will keep a reference to both the metadata as well as the object that you're storing the metadata from. Meaning that although you might never use, or the code logic might never use this object anymore, PHP's memory management can't free it because there is this mapping that is set in a structure that PHP still holds on to. Now, weak maps is something that solves that. A weak map is basically a clever way of storing a link of objects, in this case standard class, but that can be everything else pretty much, with the data from object that could be the metadata, for example. Now, normally when you would do unset obj if the map was a normal array, then it would still never be freed because there was still a reference in the map. With a weak map, that doesn't happen. So obj will get freed. PHP's internal memory manager can free up this data, and it also gets removed from the weak map. Which means that, as seemed like a gremlin that got in my code, that should of course be the pointy bracket here. There's a way of doing this, like if we have, say, a caching class, like we have the class foobar, where we define this weak map as variable name cache, then we can get something with caching. If we pass in the object, if we have it, and if the object isn't part of the cache, then we can do the recalculation of something expensive. This pattern will allow you to still do the caching, but also don't impede PHP from freeing up memory when it thinks it can do that, which is a great thing to do. Well, whether this is going to make doctrine faster or not, I can't say, but it is likely going to be beneficial for a memory footprint of things, which is where the big thing comes into play. There's a question, okay, I will continue. A whole bunch of things are suddenly now going to throw exceptions instead of warnings. And this comes back to a question I saw earlier, where a typical case is that PHP functions often returns array or false or int or false. So in this example, we have array fill. Array fill accepts 3 arguments: the starting index, basically index to start counting off, the number, so how far to how many things to count, and then have a value. So what array fill 0, 1, so say 0, 3 foo says, you'll get an array with 3 elements all saying foo. Now, if you make an error in here and you do say array fill 0 minus 100, counting upwards, you can't do to minus 100 with foo bar. Whereas in PHP 7.4 and earlier, you would get false back and a warning saying array fill number of elements can't be negative. In PHP 8, you'll get a value error. And it won't return false anymore because it can either only return array or an exception. So in the cases where giving PHP internal functions a programmatically wrong argument means these will no longer return false and a warning, but instead they will then throw an exception. Okay, so I think this is kind of neat, but we make sure not to break VC. Another tiny thing that we've added is sometimes when you catch an exception, you don't need the exception itself, and you just want to echo some information. In PHP 7.4 and earlier, you still had to have this X, or EX in this case. In PHP 8, you can just leave it out if you want to do that, which I think is kind of handy, but it's like a minute change or something. All right. Now, only as the last thing I'm talking about is PHP's JIT engine, which is curious because the just-in-time compiler, which I'll explain in a moment what it does, is the main reason from going from version number 7.4 to 8.0. It is a bit of technology that originally was the idea to get into PHP 7, when to counter Facebook's HHVM JIT engine that was touted for HHVM being a lot faster than PHP 5. Now it turned out that PHP internally could make lots of optimizations, especially with memory footprints that made PHP 7 about the same speed as HHVM again. And over the years, of course, we have improved more and more on that. Sorry, no benchmarks. But it also opened up the possibility of now do another research project to get a JIT engine in PHP for PHP 8. Now, what this does is that up until PHP 8, all that PHP does is convert your script into something that its engine can run. But the engine is basically a big switch statement that checks for what operation do I need to do now? Oh, I need to instantiate a class. And each of these operations is called an opcode. And each of these opcodes, the PHP engine will check what they are, and then will execute a little bit of code that is written in C with it. What the JIT engine does is actually, instead of interpreting all these different opcodes with all the different operations will compile internally a whole function or method at a time to native code that runs on your CPU directly. This is traditionally what would happen if you write, for example, an extension in C. These functions that you write in there gets compiled down to C code and then compiled down to assembly and binaries to run on your CPU. The just-in-time engine does this on the fly in case it sees that specific methods are used a lot, and then will run natively on the CPU without having to go through PHP engine's big switch statements to see which operations have to run. Now, anytime a function gets called, it still has to fall back to the PHP engine itself. And the function overhead calls are pretty high in PHP. So it turns out that this optimization only really does a lot if you have like really complicated math-heavy code that doesn't really call any other functions. That is not a lot of code. Now, I'm not saying that the JIT engine couldn't improve anything else, but it would be more beneficial for this kind of thing. Now, because you don't really write a lot of code like that, it doesn't tend to be that beneficial. I have seen some benchmark, they range from -10 to +10%. -10% by adding a new feature isn't great. In that case, if your benchmark saying it's going to be slow, please just turn this off. Because why would you spend more time on doing things that you don't really need to do? And in addition to that, it also makes PHP internals ridiculously more complex, because not only can bugs happen in the interpreted version, they can also happen in the compiled version of these things. Further on top of that, it will never be possible to either to debug JITted code, for example. So Xdebug will have to turn the JIT engine off, because otherwise things will just crash, because Xdebug doesn't know how to instrument C code, because it's the debugger for PHP, not for C. So yeah, although the JIT engine has been touted as one of the best or biggest features in PHP 8, it doesn't actually end out to be such a beneficial thing, but your mileage may vary, and please go play with this. PHP 8.0 Alpha 1 is out already. All right, when is PHP 8 coming out? Well, it's going to be out November 26th, hopefully. Timelines can ship. We have been pretty good in the last years to not make those deadlines ship, because we have so many alpha, betas, and release candidates. I would probably say that when beta 1 comes out, that means feature freeze has happened. That's in about 2 months, I think. You should really start testing your applications to run whether they run with PHP 8. At the moment, if you want to play with some of the features that I've shown you, please go ahead. We still are very interested in feedback, especially for things breaking, and sometimes even feedback of how to use features. If it's something that is really going to break a lot of your application through some unforeseen things that we haven't seen, then please let us know. Find a bug in our bug tracker at bugs.php.net. Having said that, as I mentioned, there's PHP internals news, where I spoke about a few of these things. Some of the things that we talk about there don't make it into PHP because they don't get approved through our RFC process. But yesterday's episode was about named arguments, so please have a listen to that if you're interested in these things. Having said that, I think I have 3 minutes for more questions. So I'll try to answer some of the questions that show up in the chat and the Q&A, and after that, I will hang out in Slack once I've managed to get myself an account there and some more breakfast. All right, first going to the chat, I think there was only, there were some comments that I misspelled construct for constructor. Sorry, I'll go fix that. And there was a question about, where did my window go? There was a question about, let's see what it said. Yusuf is asking, whether the attributes would make doctrine faster. I think they would, because you don't have to rely on a parser written in PHP to do your doc block parsing. It is all done in syntax by the PHP engine for you. So yes, it should make it faster. Frank's asking, will someday PHP support a global declare strict, so I don't have to declare it on every file. Unless opinions of quite a few people change, this won't happen. And I can't see this happening before PHP 9 comes along, which I suspect will be another, it will be more than 3 years before that happens, I think. Crumpy is asking, would it be more simple to have generics instead of long pipes? It's not an answer I can get. Long pipes are a different feature, and different people work on different features. So there we go. Martin's asking, would it be an option to have an option argument added to core functions, just like is implemented on JSON encode, as an additional parameter to have a throw instead of returning false? Well, technically that's possible, but I don't think it's a good API to have a behavior of a method depend on an argument that you pass in, like having microtimer to return either a string or a float. I think that's a bad API. So I don't think that's a good idea, but it is, of course, always possible. So Grumpy is asking, would it be possible to create custom types like mix, but what you want like bool, resource, object, null, but not allowed any other type? At the moment, PHP 8 will not have user-defined types, but there is some work being put into that to see whether that is feasible, but that won't be for PHP 8. It seems like PHP is behind on TypeScript. That is a discussion I will want to have off talk. Opinions, I will answer questions about the talk. Opinions we can do later. User 837A2BE7, that's a funny name, is asked, is there any system level configuration required or any hardware required? It's exactly the same as PHP 7, so there shouldn't be any differences there. Timo's asking, what is the best way to raise concerns about running RFCs as a simple developer? The chat cuts off words sometimes. The best way would be to reply on a PHP internals list. If you want to run your own RFC, you would have to introduce yourself to ask for a wiki karma. Bitwiki karma, you can make your own RFCs. Over the last few years, we have lots of people that are, as you say, simple developers, propose new features like the string contains and the string starts with are all done by people that were not a contributor a year ago, for example. Gabriel is asking, how difficult do you think to support PHP 7 and 8 in my project? It depends on how many features you actually opt into. The moment you start using syntax that doesn't work in PHP 7, like using the attributes, then it won't work in PHP 7 anymore. Using new introduced functions or the JIT engine, that shouldn't matter because they are not the same thing. But yeah, the moment you opt into new syntax features in PHP 8, then it won't run on PHP 7 anymore, where there's not much we can do about that. And Danny's asking as the last question I'm answering today, is there anything like user call func for the named arguments to programmatically apply an associative array to the constructor? Yes, there is. The ... operator, the arguments in there, if you would pass them in, it would still work and it will map your keys to the names of the arguments. So yes, providing this gets introduced into PHP 8, that is actually something that will work. Yeah, I talk about that with Nikita in the podcast that came out yesterday. And absolutely the last question I'm answering from Marcel is about the new string functions. Would it be possible that all string functions support multi-byte strings by default? My argument to that is UTF-8 is supported, and that is a multi-byte string. So yes, in my opinion, you shouldn't be using any other encoding besides UTF-8. But as long as you use UTF-8 multi-byte strings, it will work. And I think it'd be great that in the future, all the string functions will do support UTF-8, but it's at the moment going to break BC. And that's something we don't want to do. What I think, and I've seen some people look into, is to have a specific string class that will always be a wrapper about multi-byte strings. and you'd be able to do all kinds of interesting Unicode behavior on these things. So I think that would be the future instead of changing how PHP's internal string functions work with new behavior. All right, I've run now 3 minutes over and I started 3 minutes early. I think I should stop taking more of your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I would like to see some feedback showing up on Joined In, and I'll switch back to the slides so you can have a look. My slides will be online later, or actually they're already online at this URL. Please leave feedback at Joined In. If you have further questions, I'll hang out in the Slack in a moment. And having said that, well, thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this. And we'll move over to the next talk.
Wonderful job, Derick. Wonderful job. Thank you so much. I know everybody is standing and applauding and standing and stretching and everything. Hey, thank you so much. I love this talk, but I actually hate it because now I've got a PHP 7 talk and 8 that I've now got to go update because I've learned a lot of here. And thank you so much, Derick. Hey, okay. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, this one is a talk that is pretty much in the middle. I've been doing 7.4 talks up to now, but it's sort of too early for PHP 8. Anyway, yeah, goodbye.
My 7.4 talk has a little bit of 8 in it, but not a whole lot yet. So, okay, everybody, stand up, stretch, go get you another cup of coffee or whatever drink that you are drinking at the moment, and we've got 10 minutes. At 1:45, we will kick off with with our next speaker. I hope I'm pronouncing. I know I'm not, but I'm going to give it a shot. Mattiao. So, and I should know this because I've interviewed him on Voices of the Elephant. So, stretch, get up, and we'll be back. Make sure you're back in your seat at 1:45, the top of the hour.